The seminar today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kimberly Russell, who is at our neighbor at Diener, where she is an associate teaching professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. Before that, she was a research scientist at the American Museum of Natural History and Rutgers Newark. Kind of a Rutgers person. Before that, Kimberly is also the undergrad program director and has advised over 8 G.H. Cook Scholar students throughout her time here. So she's very active in undergraduate research, incorporating those student researchers into her lab's research, which I hope you'll hear about today. And she did get her PhD at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. All right. Wonderful.
Thanks for inviting me. I believe this is the third entomology seminar I have given in my career. I gave one back in 2017, and I have that mug exactly. And I believe I came one during my postdoc years. Oh, okay. Well done, 2004. Oh, speaking of, I was very pregnant then. Okay, it's all coming back. So always a pleasure to be back here and update you a little bit about my research. As Ann said, I put a teaching professor, undergrad program director on this slide because I just want to emphasize the fact that I have very little time to devote to research. So you can all be wowed, like, wow, she got this much done. I was just speaking about how difficult it is to balance, right, the teaching responsibilities, administration responsibilities, and research. So anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing since I've been at Rutgers and some of my current projects. And I also, the subtitle here, Meeting Native Bees' Needs, Habitat Supplementation in Urban and Suburban Environments, or How I Accidentally Became a Landscape Architect. I was speaking to Holly Nelson just the other day, and she said, you know, you think like a landscape architect. And I was like, wow, how did I get there? This is not, normally I introduce myself and I say I'm a community ecologist. Oh. So because I am a teacher and because I advise students, I just thought I would take a moment, right? Let's pause for a teaching moment about my trajectory, because where you start is not always where you end up. And I think that's an important message, particularly for any undergrads that are here, but it also applies to graduate students. And so just thinking back at my research history when I was an undergrad, I did a couple of small projects that were required. I was at a small liberal arts college. I studied dragonfly physiology. I did a behavioral study on birds at feeders by putting little eyeballs on the feeders and seeing how it affected behavior. And then I went to graduate school thinking I was going to study the evolution of social behavior in spiders. And then I decided had an existential, like, wow, I think conservation needs me more. And so I moved into community ecology, looking at how to develop monitoring protocols using spider species in forested environments to detect environmental issues. And then I got involved in a project about using AI. Back then, we just called automated species identification, artificial neural networks to do species ID. And I spent a few postdocs doing that. And then I got pulled into the work that's more related to what I'm doing now. I sort of did an organism shift to native bees, started working in sort of suburban habitats and power line cuts, which I'll tell you a little bit about today. And then finally, again, suddenly I'm a landscape architect and an extension specialist. It's just not something that I thought was in my future. So this is sort of my windy way to how I got to you today. So talk outline just to prepare you for what's coming. A little bit, we talked about this last time, I can't resist the urge to give you some background information about my group of organisms. So we're going to talk a little bit about bees' needs, just a quick review. Then I'm going to tell you about my work in power lines in suburbia using vegetation management to improve habitat for wild bees. And then my latest project, but I'm hoping to spend at least half the time today to tell you about is about working in even more urban and urbanized environments and what we can do in that setting to promote beneficial insects. So bees, what are they good for? Again, I'm preaching to the choir here. Everybody knows in this room, right, that bees are important pollinators. Obviously, they contribute enormously to agriculture. And so this is why, bees are important. Here we go. That's just my establishment there. And they're important not just for us, but of course they're also important for native vegetation, right? And so, in addition to pollinator limitation being problematic for agriculture, it's also going to be problematic for native flowering plants, especially those plants that might be in isolated environments or already experiencing some genetic deterioration or other issues. And so, again, just broad establishing that bees are important, right? And then because I'm talking to you all, I get to have these slides in, which I often remove from my talks, just sort of explaining kind of what bees are, how I'm defining them, right? Which is not me, obviously, I didn't make this decision. But again, I also teach invertebrate zoology, so I feel like I got to throw in some of this stuff. And so obviously bees are in the phylum Arthropoda, but they're specifically in the clade Anthophila. And so strictly speaking, and I love this. Oh, and it's cut off there. Okay. Strictly speaking, bees are vegetarian wasps. So if you want to think of them that way. All right. So that's why they are distinct. And if, again, I get excited to show you guys this because most people will be like, and I give this talk and they're like, what is that? But you guys can appreciate it a little bit more. So bees are up here in my little Anthophila, right? In this little nice monophyletic group up here at the top. And these are the rest of the Hymenoptera. So if you want to know, again, most of you are more familiar with the other groups, and I have to express my ignorance of any group outside of Anthophila. So I'm not familiar with a lot of the other groups of Hymenoptera. Here we are. And then, just some basic stats. There are 25,000 species described in the world. We've got roughly 4,000 in the continental US. Highest level of diversity is in the desert Southwest. Here in New Jersey, we just have a paltry 400 species, which is pretty standard for the Eastern Seaboard in terms of numbers of species. But when you get over to Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, those numbers double, and you get into the thousands of species. So it's, I try to tell people this reflects a broader pattern when we look at biodiversity across the globe. The highest bee diversity is not in tropical rainforests like so many other groups. The highest diversity is in the more mesic habitats, right? Mediterranean climes, right? They like dry. Mold and moisture is the enemy of bees. And so they like well-drained soils, dry soils, but they also form these specialized relationships with the plants that live there. Okay, so there's lots of bees. Bees are important. What is their conservation status? Well, it's complicated as always. This was a paper you might be familiar with, written by Dave Wagner a few years back, just trying to establish the complexity of insect declines that have been reported in various groups. And I don't really want to get into a lot of detail, but we do have evidence that bees are not exempt from some of these challenges, and that in certain groups of them, the more groups are declining than increasing. And now, therefore, it is a problem, right? It's a problem for us because they're important for agriculture, but it's also important for conservation generally to pay attention to them. Again, not going to get into a lot of details here, but we'll jump to bees in a second. And then just briefly, we talked about this in the lab meeting just earlier. Just to point out that my focus on native bees has a variety versus honeybees has a variety of rationale behind it. Certainly it's partly to do with the fact that I'm a community ecologist, so I'm not going to focus on one species, but also because there's a lot that wild bees can contribute to agricultural that honeybees cannot. This is a paper by Rachel Winfrey, who you may be familiar with. She does all the high-powered research with lots of grad students. And again, due to pollinator efficiency, generally speaking, your native species are more efficient. They require fewer visits to get the same efficacy in terms of plant reproduction. And so even though, we have become reliant on the European honeybee, they're a non-native species. They're not super effective at pollination. And so it would behoove us to try to find ways to boost up our native pollinators to take up some of that slack about, that the honeybees have been facing some challenges of their own, I guess I want to say. And so, it's not an easy prospect, bolstering one group, right? We talked about this too, finding ways to promote populations. And in this context, right, we're actually trying to ask native bees to do more than they likely did historically because of the crops that we've brought in agriculture. And so I'm just planting that seed now because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to seem a little bit like, well, why are you're trying to restore historical distributions of native bees? I'm not trying to restore native abundances or distribution of wild bees. I'm actually trying to enhance them because we actually would benefit from more than might have been around, 1,000 years ago. So anyway, so it's just making a point. Of course.
Species in New Jersey, which is amazing. I did not realize. Would that mean all of them are pollinators?
No, there's a small percentage that are parasitic bees, meaning that they are parasitic on other bees. But the majority, yes. I mean, all the others visit flowers. All the others visit flowers and pollinate. Not all will visit crops, right? So a certain subset of them will visit crops. And so again, the more generalist species. But yeah, they all are visiting flowers or all crops. So all but maybe how many parasitic species are there? I would say probably out of the 400, maybe 10 are parasitic. So what's causing some of these declines in native bees that we've seen? There's a lot going on here. I stole this figure from Golson and Goodall from 2011, just because it gives a nice conceptual summary of some of the things that are affecting wild bees. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on here because I'm really going to be focused on just certain aspects of this where I feel like it's possible to intervene. But certainly the challenges are happening at a variety of scales, right? You have land management, you have invasive species, you have a lot of indirect effects going on in terms of habitat availability, but then you also have a lot going on at a smaller scale that is more, I guess I would say, intervenable, right? Some things that you can do about in terms of nest site availability, food temporal availability, and food abundance. And so obviously wild bees are also affected by things like pesticides and fungicides and chemicals and land use change and all those things. But, I wanted to sort of tighten it a little bit to just focusing on the things that people can reasonably work on to improve, right, in this group. So I'm going to really focus on nest site availability, food temporal availability, and food abundance. All of these things have been shown to be limiting in certain habitats in certain areas, right, depending on what you're looking at. So sometimes when you're thinking about promoting this insect group, sometimes you're thinking about providing more food, sometimes you're thinking about providing more nesting habitat. And it's going to vary depending on the context of what is going to actually be limiting in those populations. So again, that's just sort of setting the stage here. So what can we do to help, right? So bees are important. Some of them are declining. We need them. What can we do to bolster their population? And that's sort of the theme of my research. Well, you're going to give them what they need, right? You're going to give them a place to live, and you're going to give them food to eat. It's pretty straightforward. And the food they eat are flowers. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. It sounds straightforward, of course, and most people, of course, focus on the flowers because that is obvious. That's something you can see. You can see bees visiting flowers. You can plant flowers. We enjoy flowers. We share that in common with bees. We like pretty flowers. And so that tends to be where conservation efforts are focused. But I just want to point out, I'm going to be talking a lot about nesting habitat, right? And so there's a variety of different resources that bees need in environments to allow them to live there, right? They can't just eat, they need a place to live. So just to review briefly, if you're unfamiliar, there's no bee species native to North America that lives in a hive. The closest we have are bumblebees that live in colonies underground. But again, they are colonizing pre-existing, old mammal burrows and living underneath there. So what that means is that most bees are solitary. Most female bees have to create their own homes or occupy a particular space, and that's where they're going to lay their eggs, and that's where they're going to provision for their offspring. So they're going to use it for shelter, but primarily they're using it to reproduce. And so we have miners and ground nesters. So this is depicted by this lovely drawing here that I did not do. Of course, I realize now I don't have a credit there, but I will let that in. Where they are basically burrowing into the soil, right, and creating and lining their caverns with materials to stabilize them and to buffer them a little bit from moisture. But this kind of explains why bees don't love really wet soils and wet environments, right? Because they're going to be spending most of their time underground, most of their lifespan underground, and that's where their nests are going to be. So miners and ground nesters are actually approximately 70% of all bees nest this way. That number varies, obviously, but that's the average. So it's the majority of bees, but that's what people are least knowledgeable about because we don't see them, right? We do see, though, carpenter bees, right? Most people are familiar with that. These are bees that have the ability to carve out of wood and make their nest there. You also have a little small carpenter bee. This is a Ceratina, so they're excavating just in a stem, in a woody stem, but they're still digging out the hole there, and that's where they're building their nests. And then you have these masons and leaf cutters in this scenario where they're not always making their own holes, but they are then lining them with plant material, wax material, mud that they've gathered, right? And so we have that. So all of these potential places that bees want to nest in, and they all, of course, have their own preferences of what characteristics they're looking for. I'm going to be coming back to this, but this is just sort of giving you some background here. Floral resources throughout the season, right? Again, this is something that if you try to be scientific about it and map bee phenology and plant phenology to make sure that you've got full coverage across the season, it gets really messy. Again, this is from a paper, Russo et al., not involved in this, where you try to do this in a natural environment and try to sort of match up. It's very complicated because you're dealing with in any given place 50 to 100 species in a particular habitat. And so trying to do it this way is kind of impossible. And so most strategies are just make sure you've got things flowering across the season, starting in spring, going throughout the summer into the fall, so that bees have something to eat throughout the year. Different species are going to be active, rolling over the course of the summer. Most bees are only flying for 6 weeks. And so there's huge seasonality in the community structure of these bees. With the exception of bumblebees that fly year-round, honeybees fly year-round. Most species, you're going to see this turnover across the season. So you need to sort of think about that. But again, trying to do it on a species by species basis gets very overwhelming. And so most people just focus on, okay, we just need to make sure we've got some spring flowering, summer flowering, fall flowering plants. The other thing you really need to think about, again, is to make sure that when you're provisioning flowering resources and nesting resources, that they're close enough together to be reasonably used by the same bees. We have this tendency to plant a bunch of flowers and not really think about nesting habitat is the most common thing. But bees don't like to travel very far, right, from where they're nesting, right? They want an apartment near a grocery store where they don't have to take the subway. They want to just be able, they can, in many cases, you see some of these distances are pretty impressive, 800 meters max flight, right? So these are max flight of a few well-studied species. But this guy, 27 meters is a max distance, right? Most bees, it's going to be less than 250. And then that's the max. If you think about energetically, right, it's going to be more beneficial the less distance they have to fly to get the food they need to provision for their eggs, because that will translate into more eggs, right? And so again, they really just want to forage near their nests. And so it's important to consider those things. Right. So what can we do to help? Like I said, you can plant a pollinator garden. But essentially what you want to be doing when you're doing that is create early to mid-successional habitat, again, to get all ecological on you. See, I was trained as an ecologist. I know the words. And so we're looking at things like, you might hear them referred to as prairie or meadow or scrub habitat. And so this scenario is going to be provide better habitat for more species of bees than this forested system, right? There are bees that obviously pollinate forest trees, and there are bees that specialize in the spring ephemerals that come out before the canopy closes. But again, most of the bees that we're really trying to build up are the bees that are going to be going into crop fields. They're going to be foraging in full sun. And so we want to provide habitat for those bees particularly, right? If that's our goal, to sort of make use of that ecosystem service. And the problem when your target habitat is a mid-successional habitat is that by definition, it is not stable, right? These habitats need to be actively managed to be kept in that state, right? If they are not, they're either going to become forests, especially here in the Eastern Seaboard, or they're going to become dominated by invasives. Because those habitats tend to be susceptible, right, to those domination by invasives. And so this makes bees sad. And I have a little caveat that you can't see that there are some bees that really like forests, so I don't mean to slam those. But this is kind of a problem, is that, again, trying to manage, and especially in situations where you likely don't have the personnel or the funding for continuous maintenance, right? This becomes a difficulty in providing this type of habitat. And so this is kind of where I kind of had this philosophical change of thinking about this that I alluded to before, that honestly, it came when I gave a seminar to the ecology department about similar time, 2017, 2018. And somebody asked, well, what are you trying to restore, right? Malin Pinsky asked me that. And I was at the time, I was like kind of flummoxed by the question. I'm like, I don't know, like, you know, historical habitats where they're this patchy. And I suddenly was like, wait a minute. I'm really not trying to restore anything. Like I said before, I'm trying to create or enhance things that exist already. And so again, you know, what can we do to create a stable system of this kind of habitat with the least amount of money and effort and time, right? And so that's kind of how I got pulled into thinking about the land underneath power lines, right? What you can refer to as transmission line easements. And so I was telling the story earlier, you know, when I first got involved in this research, essentially, accidentally, habitat managers back in the sort of 80s or 70s even, created a stable state mid-successional habitat through intensive management underneath power lines in Maryland. There was the place at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. The researchers cut the power line, the power companies wanted to put a line through. They worked with staff scientists, and they came up with a protocol, right, to prevent trees from interfering with the lines. But when they did that for a decade or two, they just stopped having to come back. And so what they had achieved was a stable state mid-successional habitat that had never been in that part of the country before, which is interesting, right, from an ecological perspective. But from a conservation perspective, it's like, well, if that's what your species need, if that's what your group needs, then this is a handy way to go about it. So this pulled me down that path for more than a decade, where I've been working with power companies to isolate the best possible management practices to create that or to enhance that habitat type. And so I've published a couple papers on this topic. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that today because I want to get to the new stuff. But again, it's investigating, you know, for example, comparing, you know, mowing every 4 years versus going in and using what we say is IVM, where you never mow and you just use selective herbicides. That was the main thing. I started out looking at the difference between IVM and mowing, or general herbicide use, right, would be sort of similar to mowing. And that, you know, essentially establishing that what happens when you do that is you get more invasives and you episodically are killing off your bees, right? Because you're episodically going in and churning everything. So even if you're only mowing every 4 or 5 years. And so IVM seemed to be a great way to go about it, where you're just going in, you're selectively getting rid of the species you don't want, the plant species you don't want, and thereby enhancing the species you do, right? But working with what's there. And so that's kind of the, you know, the work I'd gotten into, both the topic of those papers. One of them was research in, actually they were both research in Maryland. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been doing in New Jersey. But again, the reason why it worked out is because the industry has this mandate that they can't have any interference with the line. So they have to manage it. They have to spend lots of money keeping those trees out of the line. Plus they want to save money, right? And like I said before, if you manage in the right way, you have to come back less, right? The habitat becomes resistant to invasion by trees. So that's a benefit. You know, so they have this problem. And then, of course, we want to conserve species. We want more wildlife habitat, right? That not just bees can use, but butterflies, other early successional birds and mammals. And there's a lot of land there, right? I mean, estimates of more than 4 million hectares. And so there's a lot to work with. And so that's sort of been the theme of my work, is trying to come up with a compromise that can accomplish both of those goals at the same time. So just some conclusions without going, again, if anyone is interested in those, I can talk about those in more details later, those papers, but the take-home messages were sort of what I said, right? That the type of management matters under lines, right? Generally, it's all open habitat, so it is good, but you can do better with proper management. This integrated management style is better than just episodic mowing, right? And that seems to create a robust and diverse bee community by providing both consistent floral and nesting resources in the same place. And I did do some attempts at measuring like nesting site diversity in these habitats and sort of confirm that with data. And the benefit that rights of way have to other open habitats in the area is that, generally speaking, they're maintained in that state for an indefinite period. Whereas if you had a farm field that goes fallow, if you had even somebody in their backyard takes advantage. When I was in Wisconsin, there was a program to promote prairie restoration on people's private lands. And that's all great, but eventually they might sell the land and it just gets mowed again, right? And so the advantage that power line easements have is that they have this continual timeline, plus they go cross great distances. So if we're thinking about climate change, we're thinking about things that have continuous habitat over great swaths, they can be very useful. So again, the benefit comes from connectivity and consistency. So when I got to New Jersey, all that work had been done prior. I was contacted by PSC&G, who'd read some of those papers and said, hey, do you want to work here? And I'm like, what more could we do? Like, what would be the next step? So we know IVM is good. PSC&G had already started to adopt IVM in most of their rights of way. That had already become roughly standard practice, with some exceptions. So then the question is, well, what are the other things that we could potentially do? And so we identified, well, okay, we're going to do maybe a better, more complete study where we're going to investigate IVM versus IVM plus seeding, right? And so in this scenario, we're trying to sort of enhance what's already there. So IVM is just using what's already there. IVM plus in this scenario was trying to enhance by doing a seed treatment in the beginning, and then following up with IVM. So that's sort of that with the seed mix, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And then the company wanted me to evaluate cut stubble, which is a treatment that they use sometimes that basically it's an herbicide that kills woody stems right in the soil. And they'll sometimes do this if a right of way has been really over dominated by a woody invasive, they'll just blast it with cut stubble. So I added that in because, again, I'm working with the power companies to do this research. They're paying for all the management and that needs to be done. And I'm just measuring the bees. So I'm like, sure, I will look at cut stubble. So again, that was one element I want to investigate, the impact of seeding, if that would give us more benefit, again, it's always cost benefit, or whether, we might even go further in terms of planting plugs or trees in particular rights of way, and is that like low growing trees, obviously, and see if that's possible. So that's kind of the work I started with PSC&G. And, we identified 9 sites across New Jersey, 3 replicates of each treatment type. We've got sort of all kind of central-ish, frankly, a couple, 3 down by Pinelands area, which restricted a little bit what we could do in terms of seed mixes. But so we had for the IVM Plus, we raked and seeded in 2017, and then I conducted bee surveys for the next 4 years, 3 times a year to sort of see what sort of changes we've got there. Again, I use an army of undergrads to do this work, just giving credit where credit is due. And so every summer, we had a team doing this and trying to get a snapshot view of the bee communities and all these different treatment types. And I say all that, and I can't really give you the results yet. So this is the sadness. It takes a long time. I had roughly, I want to say 15,000 bee specimens. They've all been pinned and washed and labeled. They've been identified to genus. I have students now working really hard to enter them all into a database at this level. I've got about 60% of the species IDs complete. and about 80% of the specimens entered into the database. So it's not complete yet. There's a lot more to go. So I really haven't had time to parse the data until that happens. This is just some of the raw numbers that we see. And again, there's a lot of variation, which is something I'm going to explore over time. But, you know, the IVM sites sort of fairly consistently have higher bee abundance anyway than either the other two treatments. But again, I haven't done stats on it, so I don't want to read too much into it. And then just looking about genus level diversity, which is again a first take based on only 80% of the data that's been entered. And so this is the overall for all 9 sites, and these are the 3 treatments. And, you know, I mean, what kind of stands out to me anyway is this IVM plus does seem to have a more even distribution across the genera, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon, which might make sense. I mean, what we saw, of course, is that just blasting some seed, I mean, there's only certain situations where those seeds are going to take, right? And that might be dependent on soil chemistry and hydrology and all those kinds of things. So we don't know. But that we have vegetation surveys from all of the sites, which another data point that I'm still working through. But it'll be really interesting to see, right, if we see in the plant community what we're seeing in the bee community, and if this holds up at the species level. So again, that's all I was going to say about this because I don't have more analysis. So moving on, right? So I mentioned that was a seeding study, looking to see how seeding would impact the presence of native bees. And then I got involved in this project called the Pollinator Pathways Project with people from the Garden Club of New Jersey, Rutgers Gardens, the New Jersey Tree Foundation, and more, Audubon, all these people. We sat down at a table and said, what more can we do? And they had the idea of trying to sort of make a more garden approach. Like, let's take really high profile sections of right of way. You know, we started out right near Rutgers Gardens, right near to Route 1. And like, let's do some intensive management. Let's throw all we got at this. Let's try to build like a giant pollinator garden under a right of way and see, you know, what the cost was, see what the benefit was. And so, you know, we all thought about herbicides. The gardeners didn't want us to use any, or they wanted to use mechanical control. But the first site we started, which was at near Rutgers Gardens, was just dominated by mugwort. And anybody that's tried to kill mugwort knows it's really hard to do without chemicals. It really is impossible to do, but we humored them and we created a bunch of treatments with mechanical, trying to use like a pad, a cloth, some cardboard. We tried a few other things, but we ended up with mostly clopyralid, which is we worked with an environmental consulting firm that had a lot of information about the different herbicides and the impact on non-target species and whatnot. So we settled on that. And then we went in and we planted a bunch of plugs of shrubs that we knew were going to be useful. So we partnered with a local garden center and we got a bunch of plugs. We had some funding from these organizations and we put those in just to see what sort of effect we would have. And so, for example, these were the treatments. And so, you know, this is back in 2020, we had these experimental plots where we had glyphosate, chlorophyllid, clopyralid, mowing, paper mulch, and plastic weed. And then we did the native plantings there. You know, not to sound really, not to be dismissive, but the only things that really worked to control mugwort were the chemical controls. And even those didn't work great. We've learned that you got to continually hit them. You've got to really think about timing to hit them with, with chemicals, as well as repeated measures to get the effect you want. But I'll talk about that in a minute. But how did we go about choosing plugs? So that's another question, right? And it's tricky because we wanted to, right? Not all plants that provide resources for bees are created equal. We wanted to really be able to bring in some of the specialist bees, provide habitat for those bees that aren't generalists that require certain things. But of course, we also had to, so we had a listing of those potential plant species. But then plants that provide resources for bees, but we also wanted to pick plants that wouldn't be killed by the herbicide that was killing the mugwort, right? So they had to be resistant to clopyralid. Okay, we had some. And then we had to be plugs that were available that we could get our hands on at a native nursery. And so, it was a small list that we had. So this is what we ended up using in the right of way. And we just got a huge bunch of people and we there were some hired hands and so all of us, and we put it in, and I added this here. Of course, we also consider deer, because you have to consider deer if you're not fenced in. And so that reduces your pool of potential species right there. But again, this is what we used to put in there. And then since then, you know, we added a couple other sites for mugwort control and other rights of way sites that were a little bit more remote. And in this case, instead of going about it the other way, right, where we were sort of looking at this abstract list of plants that are good for pollinators and, you know, what was available and those kind of considerations, we sort of did the opposite, where we did a survey of the right of way, identified what was already growing there that would provide resources for bees. So we know it's capable of succeeding there, because we didn't have good survival of our plugs. I should have said that when we put them in the Rutgers Garden sites. And so we're like, okay, let's do that. And then we'll just try to enhance. And so we got plugs just for those species that already were existing there that were beneficial to bees. And so that seems to be an approach that seems much more efficient and much more higher probability of success, because again, plants are finicky. And so again, this is very qualitative. This is from a George H. Cook student thesis. But just to give you an idea that, you know, our preliminary results from these studies, that, you know, if you can reduce the mugwort cover significantly, right, through repeated treatments, then you do see an uptick of bee abundance and bee richness at those sites, which I guess is not that surprising. I mean, bees don't visit mugwort at all, even though mugwort has flowers. So basically you're getting rid of something that takes up space and doesn't flower, replacing it with things that do flower, but it's still good to see, right? The data back up what you've been doing. And so again, we're still monitoring these sites. This is early days, but this is kind of what we're seeing. So that gives us some hope. So you got to consider that. See, I spent too much time on this already. That's okay. So just to wrap up, right? Controlled succession can create valuable habitat for native bees, right? Modifying what is already there seems to be a good approach, generally speaking. Seeding can improve some sites, but it's fairly inefficient. Seed can be expensive, and you don't have a much guarantee that what you seed there is going to work well. Controlling invasives is important, but not easy. You got to pick your battles, right? You got to pick your invasives to focus on, because they're not all created equal. Mugwort is a demon. And then, you know, other things are still left to do: cost-benefit analysis, the spatial reach of habitat improvements, and then communicating the results with the power companies. Okay, still have 10 minutes, I guess. Do we have an hour? Okay, 10 minutes. Potentially the next step, now that I've already gotten into the whole, okay, I can create something instead of restoring something. I can modify something instead of destroying it. Now it's like, well, hey, I kind of got pulled into this idea of, well, what if you're in a really urban environment and there's really nothing there to work with? What do you do then, right, for native bees? And so, you know, in places that are overmanaged with very few natural resources, what can you possibly do? And so I got a call or an email, I guess, from the Horticultural Society of New York City, who was applying for a foundational grant. And I'll just tell you a little bit about, has anyone heard of the Horticultural Society? Okay, some people have. No. Okay. Well, it's an organization in New York. Their motto is everyone deserves plants. They green the in-between. So it is their job to bring plants to particularly communities that don't have access to other parks. And so they are the ones that manage the flowering plants that are in planters throughout the city. So they have an army of workers that manage the plants in these planters. They typically partner with the New York City Department of Transportation. They typically put planters in pedestrian plazas. And I think it maybe initially was a beautification thing. And so they're mostly considering what people like to see, what will survive in the planters, those kinds of things, just trying to bring a little bit of nature to these neighborhoods that don't have a lot of park space. But then they're like, hey, maybe we could do more. Maybe we could do something for bees, right? Maybe we could do something for pollinators. And so they brought me in to say, hey, can you tell us what we should be planting in the planters that will be beneficial to bees? And maybe could you help us strategize where to put these, right? So that's how I got involved. It's a really cool organization. I love it. We got the funding from the Idelson Foundation. And so I've been working with the Horticultural Society, the New York City Department of Transportation, to try to create something that could be useful for bees. And so obviously the goal is to provide resources, you know, in between the larger green spaces in New York City. But I think another big goal is to educate the public, right? Expose them to wildlife in situ. and teach them a little bit about things. And then have ultimately developed designs and strategies to be implemented in urban spaces, either by community groups or schools or municipalities. So again, this is way out of my comfort zone, but I was having these conversations. Initially, I was like, well, I can give you some plant list suggestions, but I said, but what bees really need in the city is a place to live, right? They can probably find food, right? They can probably find flowers, but they've got no space to build their nests. So what can we do there, right? So I sort of, oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. But so one thing is changing the ornamental type things that have no resources for bees, replacing them with floral resources that bees can use. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But then, nesting resources. How can we do this, right? And I was arguing that particularly in urban spaces, surveys have shown that ground nesting bees are underrepresented in urban centers. Because again, you just don't have bare ground that isn't compacted all to hell or hasn't been used and mulched over. And so there's very few places for ground nesting bees to go. And so I was like, that would be great if we could find a way to provide habitat for ground nesting bees, right? So I was like, they're like, okay, great, let's do this. And I'm like, oh crap, I got to figure out how to do this because that is not a thing that had been done before. We know about bee hotels, which I'll get to in a second, but bee, nesting habitat, it's got to be 18 inches minimum. It's tricky. And so the first thing is, right, what do ground nesting bees want, right? So we did this I had students do a literature review, how to figure out what ground nesting bees want. And it's a nightmare. I mean, again, we're talking hundreds of species here and their preferences. It's like, what about texture, particle size distribution, compaction, moisture, temperature, sunlight exposure, slope, ground cover? Pretty much everybody came to a different conclusion every paper. And so, there's very little consistency. My student found this soil texture chart. It's like really hard to figure out. And basically the way it goes is that you know where a bee nest is, you take a soil sample and you analyze it, and then you try to figure out what it is, about this versus places where those bees aren't found. You'd think it would be straightforward, but it's really not. And so, this approach didn't lead to much. Certain things are constant. Well drained. The soil has to be well drained. The soil has to have low organic matter. Bees don't want to nest where plants are going to be there and where their roots are going to interfere with the bee nest. And so it's like, okay, you need kind of bad soil for bees. So that's a sort of a universal, but everything else from like compaction to the details is very tricky. Sunlight exposure generally, absolutely. So of these, we have a few universals, but we're trying to please a lot of bees. So instead of trying to parse that, or we use that information, but then we also decided to, in the city, find some nesting habitat that we knew already existed in a cemetery, take soil samples. So that's another way to do it. Find known bee nests locally and conduct a soil analysis. So I brought it back. I didn't know about the soil testing lab at Rutgers, but now they know me. So drop them off, and you can see this is, sandy loam. Sandy loam is a descriptor that is often used for bee soils, but there's quite a difference. So this is one species. Right? These are the same species, but two different nest locations, so one has a much higher preference, right, than the other, but you get that idea. So, okay, this was based on a George H. Cook student from Nina Federica from 2022. So then what do? Well, you make an educated guess based on the data you have. This is the fun of these kinds of projects. You try to find something that might appeal to a variety of species and see what happens. I should also note there was one other study that took place in France where they did try to create habitat for ground nesting bees. They had a much larger space, a much smaller city. So they had like a big square, right, almost the size of this room that they dug down in and then replaced the soil. And they had different soil types and different quadrats with all those different factors. And they found it really seemed to make no difference. They got like equal colonization across all the different types. And I thought, yes, okay, because that was that. Hopefully this will work. And so we found a pile of dirt at Rutgers Gardens where they'd been excavating. We knew it had high sand content. So we're like, all right, let's do the analysis. Okay, well, this is within the realm of what we see here. It's sandy loam. All right, maybe. Send your students or your family members who are strong to go get dirt piles. And then, bring them back to the lab and make a bee bunker. And so, we settled on this design, which I can explain. I don't have a lot of time, but briefly, where we have a 6-gallon bucket. We fill it with this dirt. We put some landmarks at the top because bees find their nest hole entrances based on landmarks. So we put a little bit of cover there, but also to decorate it, to make it look pretty. So people, because one thing we had to consider with all this is that these are structures that are going to be seen by thousands of people on a day-to-day basis, right? So we need to think about buffering them to, abuse. I need to think about appealing, so that's a conversation for another day. So we did this because the idea, right, was to submerge the bucket in the big planter, in the giant planter. And that way you could have a surrounding vegetation, food resources for the bees, the nice high organic soil, but in the middle would be this bee bunker that would be bare, sun exposed, right? And buffered from being in the planter. If you just left a bucket outside, it's going to freeze solid in the winter. But being within, it's going to have a buffer. So this is kind of what we had to work with. We only had planters to work with. We're like, let's try it. And so that's what we did. We had a couple iterations of design, but this is kind of what we went for. And then, then we installed the bee bunkers in the planters. And I do have a quick video. We got a lot of media coverage. This was from a Japanese public television. They did a segment and they filmed us installing a bee bunker. So in one of these giant planters, we had to extract the central shrub or tree and then, bury the bucket, as it were. Puts the soil around it to make it flush as much as possible. Again, we didn't want to tempt people to just go in and pull it out or think it was garbage, and so we had to try to make it as clear as possible. Kind of like this part was fine. We only, I think, had to film it twice, lifting the bucket in and out. But then this last minute where we're putting the stones in the sign, they made us do that like 20 times to get the shot. I'm like, really? Okay, we'll keep doing it. And again, the QR code is for outreach. And then, again, very briefly, I'll skip over this because we don't have a lot of time, but they really wanted us to better engage the public. The problem with the bunkers is they're not visual, right? They're not obvious. And they wanted some other way to engage the public. And they're like, and we also want to give people, things to build, right? So what about bee hotels? Could you make us a bee hotel? And I was like, ugh, because bee hotels typically are not good, right? They get colonized by wasps and predators. Bees are vulnerable. So in a rural or suburban setting, I'm usually like, just don't bother with the hotel. It's not worth it. Bee will always pick natural habitat over that. But then I started thinking, well, in an urban center, that's probably the one place that you might actually get good colonization in a hotel. So I did the same thing. I had my students do a bunch of research. We did a literature review. We tried to come up with a design that we could install in the public place. And so we settled on using oak barrels that had been donated from local distilleries because they can only use them once. And then we installed a pole with some hardware to stabilize it for the house, so it would give it some heft. For the house itself, we set it on a screech owl box that you can get from Amazon reasonably cheaply, put it together, modify it a little bit, and then you fill it with gathered material, a combination of gathered materials, bamboo, phragmites, various things for those cavity nesting bees, but you also have some wooden blocks with holes in, which also is appealing. You often see those in things. So we designed this. Then we decorated the barrels to make them look purposeful, so people are less likely to sell them. So my students are painting them and decorating. These are not for the bees; these are for the people. Bees don't care. And then we put them next to the planters that have the bunkers, essentially in a variety of plazas. And I don't have time to talk about these. These were a different thing, not related to my project, but I can answer any questions afterwards. And then you kind of look to see what you're going to get. And I think, oh, this play. Okay, so we were there filming some of this and monitoring them. I have a student go and check on them. This was last summer, and you'd see this, and you guys know some stuff. That's not a native species. That is a recent immigrant. That's a giant resin bee. And it's one of those where there's argument as to whether it's harmful or not to other bees. The main complaint about it is that it doesn't drill its own holes like a carpenter bee. So what it likes to do, because it's the same size as a carpenter bee, it likes to go in and kick out the carpenter, kill the babies, and then colonize it. So it's a competitor for nest space with carpenter bees. But carpenter bees won't nest actually in our structures. They want to build their own holes. They don't like pre-drilled holes. So in fact, we're actually providing habitat that hopefully is reducing conflict for natural holes with carpenter bees. I don't know, that's what I'm telling myself. But it's really just, it's proof of principle, right? We've got to be interested in our structures, building nests in there. And so, we've got that. And it's New York City, home of immigrants. When I was talking, we did a press conference with the New York City commissioner, and I was like saying, hey, immigrant moms just looking for real estate. It's a place to live near a grocery store. It's the same for bees, right? So that played well. People could relate to that. And we've gotten really good feedback, I should say, when people are walking by, when we're installing. Most people are really into it. They're really excited. And you get these little community volunteers that are like defending the pollinator ports, just like it's their job. I don't know, but it's not. So again, how do we choose where to put them? It was a combination approach. Obviously, they had to be New York City DOT HORT managed pedestrian plazas. We were looking to try to make connectivity with other green spaces, so there had to be some other greenery around. They had to be reasonably close together so we could monitor them. This is the first stage, the data gathering stage. I mean, obviously, wide implementation, some of these restrictions wouldn't apply. We had to make sure there was low rat density, because rats are rats could actually burrow into these bunkers. They've been known to burrow into anything. They might mess with the hotels. We didn't know. So we tried to avoid high rat density zones. And then the commissioner, he really wanted one up where he lives in Kia, northern Manhattan. And so we're like, sure, we'll do that. That's fine. Because that one is up here, Kia Plaza, right near the Cloisters, right? So it's a beautiful park really nearby. It's a really nice place to have it. So right now we only have 5 installs active in the city. 1 in the Bronx, 2 in Brooklyn, and 2 in Manhattan. But we're planning more, as we're rolling this out. But we're still kind of gathering information. We don't know how successful they're going to be. We don't know how many species are going to use them, especially the bunkers, because that's the most new and untested of this. So from my perspective, we're still in the data gathering stage. But I think it already has had an impact in terms of public understanding of ground nesting bees, which most people have known nothing about. We've also been educating about the fact that the best way, if you're in a city, the best way to promote bees or help pollinators is not to get a honeybee hive and have it on your roof. In places where there's very limited resources like cities, honeybees are actually bad for the native bee population. So we were trying, so that part of the education is that, right? Sort of convincing people of that. And then obviously there's a lot more work I would like to do. I'm very curious about whether rural bees and city bees are different behaviorally. I think they would have to be, but I think, when we're thinking about placement of these structures, it's like, we want to think about how far are bees moving? How are they moving? Are they taking certain paths? And so I have some students doing thesis work on trying to address bee movement in the city, using marker capture. And so these are some pictures that we've done in the city where we're marking bees and then trying to track their movement. So there's a lot more to be done. But yeah, I've just kind of been pulled into this. It's new for me. It's out of my comfort zone, but it's been a great way to work with various agencies, get undergraduates involved, and also I think really spread a lot of good knowledge because it really caught the media's attention. We had kind of a media frenzy last spring. And so I think, that's something. Is it going to really help those bee populations? Honestly, it's too early to tell. Maybe not, but hopefully it will at least spread awareness.